Everyone. My name is Jason Kolbert. I'm the head of research at Boral Capital. I'm also the senior biotechnology specialty pharma healthcare analyst at the firm. I'm very excited today to have Dr. Jonathan Javitt join us. He's the CEO and the founder of NRx Pharmaceuticals, ticker symbol is NRXP. I'm excited to have you join me, Jonathan, for many reasons. One reason is Jonathan and I have known each other going on 10 years plus. Jonathan has helped me out with all kinds of stuff based on his expertise. And we're going to talk about some very serious issues here, particularly depression, bipolar depression, suicidal ideation, and Jonathan's mission, which is to address this issue. If you've ever been touched by these issues, then you get it, you understand. If you haven't been touched by it, you're lucky. If you're touched by these issues, one of the first discoveries you make is that the healthcare system, probably around the world, but let's just talk about the US, is very fractured, particularly the mental healthcare system. So if you have a broken arm, look, you can go to an emergency room anywhere in the country and basically get your arm fixed. But if you have a mental health crisis, something that we're seeing a lot more of, and I'm not here to discuss the reasons why that is, but if we're seeing mental health crises, how are those people treated? It's not as simple as going to see your doctor or going to the emergency room. And in the case of suicide, believe it or not, it can also come on very, very rapidly. And there are very few acute interventions that work, that are effective. And as a result, I think a lot of people sadly kill themselves and they didn't have to die. And so there has to be an answer. And it strikes me in my very early conversations with Dr. Javitt that this was something that he cared very deeply about. Maybe you can talk about that. And decided to do something about it. We're going to talk a little bit about exactly what he's doing about it. We'll talk about NRx 100, preservative-free IV ketamine, fast track designation, indication for suicidal ideation, patients with depression, bipolar disorder. However, we're going to talk a little bit about how that indication may expand. An NRx 101, BID oral drug, that means twice a day, combination of D-cycloserine and lurasidone. You've probably heard the name lurasidone before. It's a pretty popular atypical antipsychotic. D-cycloserine, an NMDA receptor, when combined with lurasidone, has changes the properties and it seems to help the therapy act more acutely, which is a little bit the idea behind ketamine. So the idea is rapid crisis stabilization. How do you accomplish these paradigm changes? Believe it or not, if you look big picture, you have to look at the fractured system in the United States and what it would take to make that system more organized so that there was kind of a methodology for dealing with people that are in a stage of acute crisis. So with that said, let me turn it over to Dr. Javitt. Maybe you could start off with us, Jonathan, about what was your motivation to kind of create this company?
Well, thank you, Jason. And once upon a time, I'd walk into a room and ask who in the room's been touched by suicidal depression. And, some people would definitely raise their hands and then others would. I don't do that anymore. Now I just walk into a room and say, who in this room hasn't been touched
Yeah,
by
that's
this
true.
condition? And, one or two hands go up, Then they look around and they take their hands back down. And this began for me in 2008, when I found myself sitting with the daughter of one of my closest friends the night before his funeral, saying, you know, if your dad had a short circuit in his heart and died of it, this would be a terrible day, but nobody would be blaming him. You need to understand that he had a short circuit in his brain and had no more control over what happened to him than if he died of a heart attack. I'm just for a moment going to share a picture from Nolan Williams' website. Nolan Williams developed the SAINT protocol, one of the most effective protocols using transcranial magnetic stimulation in order to save lives. He's a PhD neuroscientist, physician, and clearly talks about suicide as a short circuit in the brain, saying that the brain's cognitive control circuitry is unable to suppress the neural circuitry underlying negative mood, in which some people can result in severe impairment and thoughts of suicide. And he went to do something about it. But ironically, he posted this on his own website shortly before he took his own life.
Oh my God. Terrible.
So this is a condition that doesn't respect intelligence, doesn't respect background, belief, understanding, just like a broken arm doesn't respect intelligence. And you expect that if you have a broken arm, you can go to the hospital and get it fixed. And really, in the last couple of years, we've gotten to the point where you can have that same expectation about suicidal depression. You know, this began in many ways with research that my brother undertook in the 1980s. We began to understand that a chemical receptor in the brain called the NMDA receptor was able to control Daniel Javitt, Professor Daniel Javitt, able to control the speed of thoughts. That turned into work that John Crystal and Rob Berman did at Yale, where they discovered that ketamine was a potent, rapid-acting antidepressant, and it works by blocking the NMDA receptor. That's how D-cycloserine works as well. But there's a whole parallel school of development that began around the same time with transcranial magnetic stimulation, whereby applying very potent magnetic fields, the same strength of field as you see in an MRI machine, to the outside of the head, you can create electrical changes within the brain that result in what's called neuroplasticity, result in the brain's ability to form new connections between nerve cells. And now it's all come together because we understand that these NMDA antagonist drugs work by stimulating neuroplasticity. We suddenly understand that these psychedelic drugs, which bind to a different receptor, all of the psychedelics that people talk about, psilocybin, which had promising data yesterday, MDMA, they bind to a different receptor in the brain, the 5-HT2A receptor, but they also have a common mechanism in stimulating neuroplasticity. So, you know, what's neuroplasticity all about? If you take a bunch of sand, melt it down into a silicon wafer, etch that wafer with a laser, put 5 million transistors on that chip, you can certainly alter how those transistors behave by turning them on and off using programming. That's what computers are all about. But the connections between the transistors are never going to change from the day the laser first engraved the chip. The brain doesn't work that way. The brain's not a digital computer. Brain cells are constantly forming new connections to other brain cells and breaking those connections and forming new ones. And that process is called neuroplasticity. That's how thoughts are formed. That's how the brain works. When neuroplasticity stops, depending on where in the brain it stops, really bad stuff happens. If it stops in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, one of the first things you see is depression. And as depression worsens, you can start to see suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior. On the other hand, currently the belief is that PTSD is more a function of the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We're seeing that neuroplasticity drives cognitive decline or loss of neuroplasticity, Parkinson's, autism. All of a sudden, we're unlocking the key to the brain. And psychiatrists who have historically thought of themselves as doctors of the mind are in many ways starting to realize that they're doctors of the brain in a very physical, neurochemical, neurobiological way. And we're right at the crossroads of that. So yes, we're developing drugs that enhance neuroplasticity, ketamine, D-cycloserine-based drugs, but we're also understanding that those same drugs, and there's been some very provocative data published recently, may drastically enhance the neuroplastic effect of transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. Work was done around 2021, 2022 by a scientist named McGeer in British Columbia, showing that if you did TMS in patients with depression and suicidality, you would more than double the response rate by adding a little bit of cycloserine and increase the remission rate eightfold compared to adding placebo instead of cycloserine. That came to the fore a couple of months ago when Vaughn and Downer and others published a 1D protocol, a 1 day of TMS treatment protocol with cycloserine, suggesting that you can get to just about an 80% response in treating depression, about a 70% response in achieving remission from depression with a single day of TMS treatment compared to what else have you got? You've got psychotherapy, doesn't work very well by itself. You've got oral antidepressants. The SPEC-D trial in millions of people suggests that you've got at best a 37% response. TMS by itself is about a 60% response at best. All of a sudden, you're seeing...
Well, this is the patient's dream, and not just the patient, but the patient and their family's dream when they're in crisis mode on how do I snap my child out of the state they're in, or how do I snap my husband or my wife or my mother or my father out of this crisis stage. And up until now, I mean, ketamine has almost been, you have to work very hard today to find a ketamine clinic that can treat you. It's not
Yeah,
yet
but
mainstream.
let's step back for a second. We'll go
Good.
there, but let's step back for a second. Imagine you went into the emergency room with that kid with the broken arm, and the doctor said, the bones are a great mystery to us. We don't really understand the bones that well, but if we spend a year talking to your son about how he can better heal his broken arm,
It's a
we think that
disaster.
that would be big. We think that would be helpful. Or
Right.
we have some pills to offer you that over the next 5 or 10 years might make his broken arm better, but in the process, he'll gain weight. He'll have sexual dysfunction. He'll have a number
Acne.
of side effects. You really wouldn't be very excited about what was being offered.
Yeah,
Right now, the only treatment, the only FDA-approved treatment for suicidal ideation is electroshock therapy. And lo and behold, the government funded a trial where people were randomized either to several weeks of electroshock therapy, so being anesthetized over and over again, having a seizure induced in their brain, versus 3 weeks of IV ketamine infusions. And the ketamine worked just as well. It's actually slightly better, but it was a non-inferiority trial, so all they can claim is just as well as the electroshock. But of course, the electroshock induced memory loss in a third of the patients, whereas ketamine didn't induce memory loss in anybody.
Mhm.
On the other hand, you say, well, it's hard to find a ketamine clinic. If you do find a ketamine clinic, not, by the way, I'll bring my dog too, Jason. Willie, you want to come join? No, Willie's asleep. If you do find a ketamine clinic, 9 out of 10 of them really don't have interventional psychiatry oversight. There are a lot of these clinics that do ketamine on Monday and peptides on Tuesday and vitamin drips on Wednesday. And they're playing with a class 3 dangerous drug and they don't know what they're doing. If you go looking for a clinic that's combined ketamine with transcranial magnetic stimulation with really intelligent psychotherapy, and the next leg of that stool is hyperbaric oxygen, you can count those on your hands and your toes.
100%. I agree. So you stated the problem beautifully. You've talked about your motivation behind this. Give me an update as to where we're at, but I'd like you to tie into it this idea that, you're a public company developing on the verge of approval on two, very important drugs, NRx 100 and NRx 101. But what's the connection to the clinic? And I understand 3 clinics today are acquired: Kadima Neuropsychiatric Institute, Dura Medical, Cohen and Associates.
We've not finished the Kadima acquisition. We've said in our financial reports we're not certain whether that's going to get done. Dura is seeing patients every day at multiple locations as Cohen is about to add a new location. So we're seeing patients get better every day. Just a couple of weeks ago, and you'll appreciate this, as I won't call you a former Marine because you've told me that there's Marines and dead Marines, but there's no former Marines. Just a couple of weeks ago, our nurse at one of the clinics, a retired lieutenant colonel from 82nd Airborne, guy used to get thrown out the back of a C-130 and told to set up a hospital under fire, was treating a woman with ketamine. At the end of the infusion, she tried to hug him. She couldn't get her arms all the way around him. And said that she'd come into the clinic that morning planning to kill herself, and she doesn't know where those thoughts went. That's how rapid the effectiveness of ketamine can be. So why did we get into the clinic business? In some ways, we did it because nobody else was. When I really started to look at what I thought was happening in this space, first of all, the word neuroplasticity was a new word. In fact, it became very widely used about 5 months ago after I spoke on a panel in a conference with all the psychedelic drug manufacturers who were suddenly running into various challenges, although Compass seems to have crossed the valley of death, but running into various challenges, and people realizing that telling a patient they need to take a trip in order to get better might not be the best thing, especially since all of a sudden you've got a couple of molecules coming along that are tweaks of the psilocybin molecule that achieve the same antidepressant benefit without causing hallucinations. So, I kind of said, hey guys, it's neuroplasticity, stupid. It's not about the hallucinations. Those are an effect of these 5-HT2A drugs, but that side effect may well not be needed for the beneficial effect that we're all looking for.
Gotcha.
So the challenge for me is that nobody was really integrating neuroplastic care in a scalable, intelligent way. And we're talking about neuroplastic drugs, whether they're NMDA antagonists, 5-HT2A antagonists. We're talking about transcranial magnetic stimulation. The third leg of the stool is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And this came from totally really left field, outside the psychiatry world altogether. It started out with an Israeli doctor who's a wound healing expert. General internist, spent his life trying to rescue diabetic feet and other wounds that were not responding to medical therapy using hyperbaric oxygen. And somebody showed him data suggesting that PTSD may in fact be a deep wound of the brain. And there are animal models that prove that very elegantly. So one of them is called the predator response model. Throughout 5 million years of evolution, rats have learned that cats are a really bad thing to be around. And rats that haven't learned that got eaten and didn't reproduce. So rats have very, very deep ingrained circuitry to avoid anything to do with predators, particularly cats. Well, one way to give a rat PTSD is to put a vial of cat urine in the rat's cage. And within an hour, that rat will have acute PTSD, have all the aversion symptoms that are related to human PTSD. Put that rat in a hyperbaric chamber versus a sham chamber, and that PTSD will get better.
Well, so it's
Now,
really interesting. You're
but let me
presenting
just take it one more step.
Sure.
If you section that rat's brain, which we obviously don't do to humans, you will see all the hallmarks of a wound. You'll see necrotic cells, you'll see inflammatory debris, you will see a biological wound in that rat's brain, even though nobody touched the rat. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's good. What you're doing is you're making the scientific basis, right? The anatomical changes that are connected to behavior. Uh,
Yes, we're going from thinking that the mind is something other than biology to saying this is biology.
right.
And we should treat it no differently than we approach Parkinson's or cognitive decline. Could psychotherapy be helpful? Yes, psychotherapy certainly helps people understand their situation. And there are specific forms of psychotherapy that are believed to induce neuroplasticity.
Sure. So along on this mission, connect that thinking to the clinics. And I think what you're saying is, look, there are all these clinics, and each one may be working at one different modality, but nobody is looking at the total armamentarium of tools available and then scaling and adjusting them to the patient profile. And you're
Well,
saying,
I won't say nobody because we are,
right,
and some of our partners are. I'll give you one good example. There's a program going in the Midwest with a fire commissioner because a firefighter represents 5 years of training, $200,000 worth of training. That person has PTSD. That person's off the truck. And firefighters see horrible things on a daily basis. And firefighters face their own death not infrequently.
right,
And the result is they go to sleep with things on the back of their eyelids that they can't ever unsee.
right,
So firefighters are 5 times more likely to have PTSD. If you are if you're the fire commissioner for a region and you've got a firefighter who's off the truck, you've got a high motivation to get that person back in function. And we've got a program. It's a 6-week program. It's not inexpensive, but it's a whole lot less expensive than having that person off duty that combines psychotherapy with TMS, with ketamine, with hyperbaric oxygen. We expect to introduce cycloserine to that very soon. That so far has shown a 90% chance of putting that person back on the truck. And it's not only firefighters. A police officer who's on SSRI antidepressants has to turn in his gun and sit behind a desk. Paramedic can't be out there in the field. A pilot is grounded by the FAA. So those are only some of the people who most acutely need this kind of intensive program. And they're people who are at a 5-fold elevated risk of suicide because of the work that they do. And we lose 22 veterans in active duty every day. When I'm not doing this, I fly as an aviator for the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. Coast Guard stood down the entire force of 44,000 active duty and 22,000 auxiliarists for a day of training on stress resilience and suicide prevention. Because we lost 14 shipmates to suicide in a year, not a single person to operations, even though we dangle people by wires over Arctic waters.
I gotcha. Believe me, I understand. So the idea is that these clinics create a model, and as places like a fire department or other institutions start to see the benefits, that you're basically going to change the treatment paradigm, and you're making the commitment to kind of be the tip of the spear in terms of that change. Is that a fair summary?
Well, not only be the tip of the spear, but our aim is to be able to say to a payer, not just a local payer, but to a national payer, uh, we're going to take care of your beneficiary, whether it's a firefighter, a police officer, an investment banker, a stock analyst. We're going to take care of that person for you. We can do it within driving distance of that person's home. We'll get them onboarded an hour after we get off this phone call. We'll show you the results and we'll be accountable for the results.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. That's a huge paradigm shift, and the potential in that is incredible. Talk a little bit about, let's go back now to NRx 100 and NRx 101. We talked about NRx 100, which may not be, in my mind, as sexy as NRx 101, but it has teeth. So tell me, NRX 101 was really born first, right? You looked at the combination in part based on your brother's work of D-cycloserine and lurasidone. But then you kind of looked at ketamine. So how did that involve? Because they're very different
Well, so
programs.
yeah, well, they are and they aren't. So, all of this began, as I said, it began with Dan's original discovery of the role of the NMDA receptor in psychiatric disease. And he wasn't trying to do anything related to depression. He was trying to understand why angel dust causes acute psychosis. So back in the 1980s, when he and I graduated from medical school, there was this abuse drug, angel dust or phencyclidine, that was being added to marijuana. And for a lot of people, it was an intense high. And then for a small minority of people, it was a trip to the psychiatric hospital with acute schizophrenia. So Dan said, what's going on here? Where's this binding in the brain? And if we figure out where it's binding in the brain, can we learn something about schizophrenia? And he discovered, I had nothing to do with it, that phencyclidine was a irreversible and potent binder to the NMDA receptor. And for the next 10 years, all of this work was purely a really hot and exciting model for understanding schizophrenia. And then John Crystal and Rob Berman at Yale said, well, let's learn more about this. Can't give phencyclidine to human beings. It's way too dangerous. But ketamine is the first cousin. It binds in the same place, but it binds reversibly. Let's give people ketamine and see what happens and understand the hallucinations. And lo and behold, a bunch of people called up the next day and said, Doc, whatever I got yesterday, I got to have some more of it because I've been depressed for 20 years. Today's the first day I'm not depressed. And they kind of said, holy shit, and did a study. And sure enough, ketamine was a potent, rapid-acting antidepressant. So Dan saw that data and said, well, I know why it works because I discovered that receptor. But, ketamine is hallucinogenic. It's addictive. It's a neurotoxic. If you give too much ketamine for too long, you turn the brain to Swiss cheese. Can we find some safer, more controllable molecules? And lo and behold, there was a bunch of data on cycloserine, which is kind of like the difference. If you think of ketamine as putting a cork in the NMDA pipe, cycloserine is like turning a faucet. And it was originally invented as a tuberculosis drug. And its effect in the brain has nothing to do with its effect on tuberculosis. In tuberculosis, it blocks it fools the cell wall into becoming porous. In the brain, it happens to bind to this particular receptor in the brain. Two completely different effects of the same tiny little molecule. It just shows that God has a sense of humor. And so it turns out that back in 1959, a tuberculosis doctor named Crane noticed that patients on cycloserine were less depressed. And he actually published some papers showing that cycloserine was an antidepressant, but they had just discovered that a different tuberculosis drug had antidepressant effects, and they developed that one, and it turned into the first monoamine oxidase antagonist antidepressant. So people said, "Oh yeah, we already know about those tuberculosis drugs," and nobody looked at cycloserine again until the ketamine data came out. So, science works in strange ways. But that's kind of how the two drugs started being developed. Dan and colleagues did a study in Jerusalem showing that cycloserine had value as an antidepressant. The problem is it's known to cause some hallucination because any NMDA antagonist causes some hallucination. But they discovered that if they combined it with serotonin active drugs, the serotonin antidepressants, the 5-HT2A antagonists, not only could they block the hallucinations, but the NMDA drug, the D-cycloserine, in turn blocked the akathisia side effect. That's the reason every one of these serotonin antidepressants has the potential to cause suicide. So that's how NRx 101 got born. And it's been working its way through the clinical trial pathway. Company almost died during COVID. We were within milliseconds of laying off the whole team when Relief Therapeutics came along and asked us to work on a COVID drug that probably would have worked and been a successful COVID drug if the pandemic hadn't ended. But by the end of the pandemic, we'd gone public and we still had enough money left to get back into psychiatry. So it's been a bit of a circuitous path.
It always is, by
It
the way.
always is in biotech.
Very few people can understand this, right? But the fact is, science is never a straight line. Clinical trial enrollment isn't a straight line. Capital raising is not a straight line. And so there are many, many factors, right, that impact your timeline. And this is important because a lot of people look at my analysis of NRXP and they go, well, why do you have such a high price target? This is a microcap biotech. And I always tell people, look, I never cheat the metrics, right? We have the right discount rate. We have the right therapeutic rate cuts on our models, and our valuation comes out what it is. It comes out legitimately to where we think it should be. We use fully diluted numbers, meaning we take into effect, right, the need for capital. Why am I interrupting you to say this? In part because I want people to appreciate the evolution of your own thinking, of your motivation, of the science to get to where you are today, which is on the precipice, right, of bringing two very important drugs into the mainstream for psychiatric care. And that involves acquiring clinics, changing the treatment paradigm in for people with acute need. So,
And that's really, that goes back to the answer you were looking for earlier, which is why did we get into the clinic business? We
right,
can't change the treatment paradigm unless we're changing the treatment paradigm.
right.
Because,
I mean, and there are very, very few people, by the way, that'd be willing to go that distance. A lot of people would say, "Oh, I'll just develop the drug, and what happens, happens." So, and I have to say that's kind of, in my mind, in part, what makes you unique. Combination of very high level of personal motivation, but it's looking at the entire picture, right? And what things do I need to change about the picture so that when the drugs are approved and being commercialized, you're already building the channels, right, to for them to be utilized in the marketplace.
well, and people say, Javitt, you're an ophthalmologist. What are you doing in this business? And my answer is no, I'm a physician.
Right.
I'm the ophthalmologist who never went to work without a stethoscope in his white coat pocket.
Right.
And
And a
on a regular
scientist and
basis,
a venture capitalist,
yeah,
right?
on a regular basis, found myself calling somebody's internist and saying, I'm sitting here with your patient who's got little micro emboli in his retina. I can see them with my ophthalmoscope. And when I took my stethoscope, I listened to his neck. He's got bruise. That's a high pitched sound coming out of his carotid artery. And he probably needs a carotid ultrasound right away because he could have a plaque that could cause a stroke. And, some doctors would say thank you, and some doctors would say, what business do you have doing that as an ophthalmologist? And I would say, well, first and foremost, I'm a doctor.
I listen, I talk to doctors all the time and they ask me what my specialty is. I tell them equities. So I totally understand. Close with me, Jonathan, on where we're at. What should we expect in terms of the timeline for 100 and 101? And how are you going to get there?
So 100 bifurcated about a year ago because we realized that, yes, we're developing it for treatment of suicidal depression, but it's ketamine. And ketamine is a $750 million current market today.
Key
And
point.
in the process of formulating NRx 100, I looked at the formulation. I said, well, wait a second, what's this benzethonium chloride doing in there? And the only reason that it meant anything to me is, again, because I'm an ophthalmologist. And back in the 1990s, one of my friends at the Wilmer Institute asked, why does everybody with glaucoma have dry eye? What does glaucoma have to do with dry eye? And we figured out that the dry eye syndrome was caused by the benzalkonium chloride preservative in all of the eye drops at the time. Because benzalkonium chloride, which is, first cousin of benzethonium chloride, poisons the goblet cell in the conjunctiva that creates the lipid layer of tears. So if you poison the goblet cell, you get dry eye syndrome. Take the benzalkonium chloride out of the eye drops, and glaucoma patients don't have dry eye syndrome. So I said, what's the stuff doing in there? And they said, oh, well, it has to be there. It's a required excipient. Otherwise, the ketamine won't stay in solution. And I said, really? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Why don't we just, make me some without it? And they said, oh, it's going to precipitate. I said, that's fine. It's my shareholders' money. Just make me some. And, sure enough, 2 and 3 years later, that stuff is rock solid stable. So we've got preservative-free ketamine, which we filed under an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application, to replace the ketamine that's being sold worldwide today that has this toxic preservative. Because you can't make a drug with benzalkonium chloride today. It's so toxic that the FDA doesn't allow it to be used in hand cleaners or topical antiseptics, much less put into an intravenous drug. So it's crazy that everybody who gets ketamine for
Crazy.
anesthesia.
Any college level organic chemist knows the toxicity of that molecule.
Right. So we filed a citizens petition with FDA and said, please take this out of ketamine. Now, normally FDA would say, yeah, but that's going to create a worldwide shortage of a critical drug. Well, in this case, yeah, but we got 1 million vials in the warehouse and we can make 1 million a day if we have to. So on one level, really just by accident, by paying attention to what we were formulating rather than copy what everybody else had done, we've wound up with a novel formulation of ketamine that could wind up taking a big piece of that $750 million generic market. And we're continuing to develop ketamine as a drug that would compete with intranasal S-ketamine, which currently is a $2 billion drug. But there's some reason to think that it certainly doesn't work less well than S-ketamine. It may work better in terms of relieving suicidal ideation.
What's
And
the
just,
timeline for this to the
well,
marketplace?
that's where I was going.
Good.
But, with a few more words than you wanted. We just had a meeting last week with FDA. It was an in-person meeting. That's not so common these days. And not only was the Division of Psychiatry Products in the room, but so was the leadership of the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Because, as I said in my opening sentence, during the 1 hour we're going to be meeting, another 6 Americans will die of suicide. That's what we're dealing with. So we just put out a press release yesterday. We don't have the final notes from the meeting, but we got enthusiasm for not only submitting existing clinical trial evidence of efficacy, what they call substantial evidence of effectiveness. One of the most convincing trials is this PCORI-funded trial where people randomized to ketamine versus electroshock. Ketamine was non-inferior to electroshock. That's the just as good measure. If you look at it statistically, it was actually better than electroshock in reducing depression. If you look at it from a safety perspective, the electroshock group had 30% memory loss. 30% of the people in the group had memory loss, whereas nobody in the ketamine group had memory loss. So clearly a preferable treatment by most people's definition. That on top of dozens of clinical trials where ketamine has been compared to placebo, has been compared to active drugs like midazolam, and over again showed superiority in reducing depression. In fact, the difference, if you look at an antidepressant drug, they call 3.5 to 4 points of benefit on the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale compared to placebo. And that's what you saw with the Compass data yesterday, whereas ketamine is about twice that effect size. So dramatic effect both on depression and suicidality. FDA said they'd work with us on agreeing to the protocol by which we're going to analyze 65,000 patients of real-world evidence supplied by Osmind, who has the medical record system that powers lots of psychiatry practices. So we're expecting to be filing an NDA before the summer, and that's a new drug application with the potential to be marketing a labeled form of intravenous ketamine, NRx 100, to treat people with depression and suicidality. Originally, we were talking to FDA just about a label for suicidal ideation in depression. That's about a 3 million person population. And based on the meeting we had, we're going to be filing for depression in the context of, or we may tweak those words, but depression of people who may have suicidality. That's about a 10 million person indication.
And completely not even factored into my work and my model. I mean, that's just complete
Well,
upside.
you want to put it into your model, but then people will really think your valuation's
Right.
great.
Then they already think I'm nuts. Um, what happens to the preservative ketamine? Does that get knocked out of the market?
Yeah, it ought to disappear. There's absolutely no excuse for injecting benzethonium chloride into people's veins.
Yeah.
An artifact
Okay.
of the 1970s.
Gotcha.
And
All right.
the
So
only
let's
reason it's in there is because people started making these multi-dose vials where you could use the same vial for more than one patient. And the rule was you had to have a preservative in the bottle.
all right, close out with me on the timeline for 101.
101 has a whole new life. So as the ketamine moved to the forefront, we do need to get back in the clinic and do another definitive clinical trial for 101 as an antidepressant. At the same time, you've got this incredibly exciting data showing that the active ingredient in 101, the D-cycloserine, may double the effectiveness of TMS. So we've just filed an IND with the FDA to start to prove that, and it may turn out that that's the more important use for 101.
So what I hear you saying is let the cash flow driven by NRx 100, right? Commercialize that product, build out the clinic footprint, and then as the company builds its balance sheet, you achieve some flexibility in terms of ultimately driving 101 back into the market. Sorry, driving 101 into the marketplace, into the treatment, as one of the treatment choices of the physician armamentarium.
Yeah, not only the cash flow from both flavors of the ketamine, but the clinics themselves are profitable.
Right. Okay. Very good point too. Um, Great. So we've been talking with Dr. Jonathan Javitt. If you're interested in the story, and I think you should be, just let us know. Shoot us an email. We'll be happy to share the report, share the model with you. You can see this up on our website. And I'd like to thank Dr. Javitt for taking the time to walk through this story. I know how frustrating it must be at times to kind of work with an evolving timeline and capital financing needs and a low valuation. But it's pretty clear to me as an analyst that NRx 100 becomes kind of the means, and the end ultimately is kind of just changing the entire treatment protocol for not only acute, but acute suicidal ideation to me is just this glaring unmet medical need. Depression is terrible, but you have a little bit of time until you don't, right? So it's just there's such a tremendous need. And I think from an analytical point of view, why am I following microcap biotech stocks, right? Um, it's been a good 2 weeks for Coca-Cola. KO has rallied beautifully, very low risk. Well, what an interesting name, right? But the fact is, Coca-Cola is never going to transform itself. It's a very stable company. Everybody likes a Coke. You want to talk about
I
a,
liked it better when it had cocaine in it.
well, and and a company like NRxP can transform the entire treatment of depression, suicidal ideation. And in doing so, right, your valuation can be transformed. And I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're not 5 years away. We're going to see the launch of ketamine into you heard Jonathan talking about it being a $750 million market and also a $2 billion market. So at just a fractional piece of that market, the cash flow comes in, the balance sheet of the company builds, and the company continues to execute on its mission. So take a look at the stock. We think it's interesting. Dr. Javid, thank you. Any last words?
Well, I think the most important thing is take a look at our clinics. If you want to understand what we're doing, come visit.
Wow. So, for those of you who are channel checkers, take up Dr. Javid on that. All right, Dr. Javid, thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Bye bye.
Thank you.